Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Kaiya, and today we are finally going to be doing the Cannibal Corpse Deep Dive Part 2, the Corpsegrinder era. I know a lot of you who watched Part 1 have been waiting very patiently for me to get this part out, and it's finally here. It's taken me quite a while to do this video, so I'm very excited to share it with you today. I'm very proud of it, and yeah, basically if you are here and you have not seen Part 1 yet, I highly encourage you go do that. It'll be tagged with this video, but that is exploring all of the first 4 albums with Chris Barnes as the singer. We go through the entire history of Chris Barnes. We go through Tyrant Sin, the recording of each of the 4 albums, all the drama and the history and everything. So that is where we left off. If you just want to get right into the deep dive, I will have a timestamp. You can go ahead and just skip my little intro. So first, I want to give a huge shout out to Paul Mazurkowicz, who's the drummer of Cannibal Corpse, if you're not fully aware, for helping me with this video. He reached out to me on Instagram and basically, said that Part 1 was really good and that, if I had any questions, I could ask him. I ended up having a few questions about some of the things within my research, and he was so kind in taking time out of his day. They just came back from their US tour with Amon Amarth, getting ready for a European tour. So thank you so much, Paul, for everything, for just taking time out of your day, for helping me with this video. I really do appreciate it. It was awesome to connect with you, so I very much appreciate that. And I will also say that I am using an audio sample from one of Paul's questions. I did ask for permission, so do not go into thinking that I am disrespecting his wishes in any way by using the audio sample. I just want to clear that up in case you have questions about that. So I want to address a couple comments. The first one is how I pronounced Barrett in my last video. So I pronounced it originally as Beret, and people told me that it was Rob Barrett, so I apologize for that mispronunciation. My last name is French, so I just read it as a French name. I did correct it for this video though. And then I also want to mention the Created to Kill demo / bootleg. I did not mention that in Part 1, partly because I had no idea it existed. So I may have just not, I obviously just did not look too hard or whatever. I failed to mention it in there, but I did end up actually finding it, on YouTube, and I was able to stream it. So it was cool to be able to catch up on that side of the history. So even though I did not, mention it in Part 1, I do know now that it exists. So for reference of this video, there is a Created to Kill demo, which you can stream for free right now on YouTube if you want to kind of catch yourself up on that. Another quick disclaimer, just like I did in Part 1, I am not of the generation that grew up with Cannibal Corpse. I was born in the mid to late 90s, so everything that I am talking about is from my own personal research. So I'm not trying to come off as some elitist or some metal expert, or that I know everything and anything that happened during this time. Obviously there's many details that I could be missing, so I highly encourage you to share me your experiences that you have with Cannibal Corpse. Have you seen them live? If there's anything that you want me to, if there's anything that needs to be corrected, feel free to do it in the comments. Don't be a dick about it though, okay? Oh god, I say that in a very nice way. Share me your experiences. Let me know, anything that you have come across. That's kind of where that is. Without further ado, let's get into the deep dive of Cannibal Corpse Part 2, the Corpsegrinder era. George Fisher, a brief introduction. George Fisher was raised in Baltimore, Maryland, where he began taking an interest in singing as a teenager. Just like Chris Barnes, George loved to sing along and jam to various metal artists such as Slayer, Possessed, and Deicide. George said, "I basically sat up in my room and I had my stack of metal records by different groups. And I just go like, oh man, I'll listen to this today. So I put one in and start singing the song. I had this 2x4 that my friends called the Rickenboard, like Rickenbacker, and I would just hold it like a guitar and I would just start singing the Slayer albums. Do a few songs off Rain and Blood, some old Deicide, put that on. Put on Seven Churches, listen to that. Maybe finish off with Pleasure to Kill by Creator. And there you go. Next day I'd get up and do the same thing. I always wanted to be in a band, but I never really looked at it like, okay, I'm gonna practice. I just loved singing along to those albums and trying to emulate the guys who were in those bands, trying to copy how they were singing. I was really influenced by Chuck Schuldiner of Death, because he had those long screams, and that was my biggest influence. He was the one guy that I always had the hardest time trying to copy. His voice was such that I always wanted to do those things, but lower and louder and make them sound vicious. It was really hard to try to recreate what Chuck was doing, but that's how I started singing. In 1989, when George was about 19 years old, he would join his first band, Corpsegrinder. This is not to be confused with his current solo project of the same name, where he's released a self-titled full-length in 2021. Although the band Corpsegrinder did have many vocalists during this time, it's unknown whether or not George Fisher was the vocalist of their first demo from 1990, Deader Than Life. On Discogs, he's listed as the vocalist. On Metal Archives, it says unknown. Despite this, George would join Monstrosity in 1990 and begin traveling to and from Tampa, Florida from his home in Baltimore to record and play shows with them. So it's possible he originally joined the band Corpsegrinder as their singer prior to recording or performing with them. George was credited as the vocalist on their 1993 demo titled Shadows. This would be the band's last demo, as they would soon split up. As far as George getting his stage name Corpsegrinder, he mentioned in an interview with Mark Prindle that the nickname came from Lee Harris, the drummer for Monstrosity, who called him that based on his history with his first band in Maryland. Now that we have been introduced to George Fisher, I want to take us back into the studio with the remaining Cannibal Corpse boys and Scott Burns. Chris Barnes has just been relieved of duty, and now it was time to find a singer. Created to Kill, Vile, 1996. After Alex Webster and the remaining band members had sacked Chris Barnes, there was a sense of both relief and stress for the band and Scott Burns, who were sitting there in the studio having absolutely no idea who their new vocalist was going to be. They were throwing around names and trying to ignore the pressure and anger coming from Metal Blade label executive Brian Slagle. All of the instruments were recorded for this new record that was supposed to be called Created to Kill. All they needed was a vocalist. As they were throwing names around, Rob Barrett suggested they bring in George Fisher, or as he was also called, Corpsegrinder, who at the time was the lead singer of Monstrosity, which is a death metal band from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Corpsegrinder had been the lead vocalist for Monstrosity since their 1990 demo, which by this point in time the band had already released their debut album, Imperial Doom, in 1992, and were well on their way to releasing their second album titled Millennium. Alex Webster would then end up calling George at his Baltimore home and inviting him to the studio. Corpsegrinder said this about the phone call. Alex called me right before Halloween in 1995. He said, "You're the guy, but we might call other people if you come down and we think it doesn't sound the way we want." I was arrogant enough to say, "Hold up. Don't call anybody else. I'm telling you, I'm very good at this right now." I was 25. Rob had this to say in the Scott Burns Sessions memoir, talking about how he knew George Fisher. "I was living with Lee Harrison from Monstrosity at the time. When we all moved down to Tampa, I called Lee because we went over to his house during the bleeding to hang out, and I remember he had a spare bedroom. Before we moved to Tampa, I called him. 'Hey, do you still have that spare room? I'll rent it out from you. We're moving to Tampa.' He was like, 'Yeah, man, cool, move in.' When I moved down, I moved right into Lee's instead of finding my own place, which was pretty convenient. I would see George a lot because he would come down whenever Monstrosity was doing stuff. He was still living in Baltimore at the time. He would either fly or take a bus down. He used to take Greyhounds all the way down to Florida back at the beginning of Monstrosity sometimes, which was crazy. That's a long drive. He used to be at Lee's house whenever Monstrosity was doing shows or working on new stuff. He would come down and stay for at least 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Whenever he stayed at the house, I often hung out with him. Once George started working with Cannibal Corpse a little bit in the studio, it was obvious to the rest of the guys that they made the right decision. To Alex Webster, Corpsegrinder was a fun, loving, happy-go-lucky guy with a great positive attitude that the band desperately needed. Not only that, but Corpsegrinder, of course, delivered in the vocal department as well. George had the power, energy, and screams to back up the intensity of the instrumentals. However, the new challenge the Cannibal Boys were facing now was having new lyrics to sing for these songs. Since the main lyricist left with Chris Barnes, the band had to rewrite everything. This would turn into a group effort with Alex and Jack writing lyrics for most of the tracks with a little bit of help from Paul. Here's what Paul had to say about losing Barnes as a lyricist. "We felt we bettered ourselves, but lost a lyricist in Barnes. It all worked out though. I'm glad it happened this way because it's not just one of us writing the lyrics. We're all getting a hand in there. At first, it was interesting because we figured the vocalist wrote all the lyrics. But with George, it was a matter of, look at what we're getting here. We're getting the best death metal vocalist there is." Now, I don't know about you, but I have always been curious about what George Fisher thought of Chris Barnes, especially what he thought about taking Barnes' role immediately after the fallout. In this book, Corpsegrinder is interviewed about his opinion on Barnes, and this is what he had to say. "I never had a problem with Chris. Whatever happened with me joining the band was not a personal issue. It wasn't like, screw him or anything. Alex just called me, and I was this arrogant little asshole. It was very much, dude, you are not going to regret this. I'm the best. I thought plainly, yes, I'll be better than Chris. And I don't think Scott had a problem with Chris. It was just a professional thing. Like, this guy's not going to listen. The lyrics he wrote and the patterns he came up with, he's not singing on time. Chris just wanted to get in, get out, and do his tour. Scott pushed those guys. Rob was playing me versions of Vile when it was called Created to Kill. I was like, wow, this sounds like some of the best stuff that Barnes has done. I don't think that the high stuff was that great, but the low stuff I thought was not so bad. I was just, wow, that's pretty good. If someone says Barnes' voice sounds better, eviler, more brutal, deeper, lower, whatever, that's their opinion. When it came to timing, I'm sorry, he's probably the worst in the pack. Listen to the last 6 Feet Under album. 2020's Nightmare of the Decomposed. He's off time all over the place. That's because he wants to sing things straight through, and the guys at Criteria Studios let him. I'm not trying to sling shit here. After everyone got somewhat comfortable with each other, it was time to record. Scott Burns said, "Devoured by Vermin was the first song we tracked with George. That was to be his introduction to Cannibal. The litmus test was going to be the scream at the very beginning. He had to get it right. It's a pretty long and challenging scream, so I wasn't surprised he needed a few takes. George was also very nervous, so I did my best to calm him down."
Devoured by Vermin was the first song we started tracking. And I remember, the first part of that song, the infamous part is the boom, 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 the scream. That's the first thing people ever heard of me. Okay, who's this fucking dude replacing, the singer of Cannibal Corpse? I remember I was doing that scream and it was just sound like shit. And, I was probably nervous, as arrogant as I was, like, call anybody else out, man, I can do it. I have to admit, I was just like, I remember it wasn't working out. The scream was just not sounding good, and I'll never forget, I said, give me a second, I can take a piss. So I went to the bathroom, and this is Hollywood as it gets, but I looked in the mirror and I said, this is your fucking shot, blah, blah. I cussed at myself, looked at myself like, fucking better do this, and I went back out. And when I went back out, I took a drink of water and said, okay, let's go.
And so the album that was once known as Created to Kill was changed to Vile, and once recorded, it was released on CD and cassette format on May 20th, 1996, just 3 months before Monstrosity's second album, Millennium, would be released that same year. This would end up being Corpsegrinder's final album with Monstrosity, as his new career as the lead singer of Cannibal Corpse would begin. Vile would also be the last Cannibal Corpse album Scott Burns would produce before his inevitable retirement. What I found interesting was that Vile would not be released on vinyl until 2009, So if you are looking to pick up an original copy for your collection, you will need to start there. Thankfully though, Metal Blade has done several represses since then, including one picture disc in 2013, so you shouldn't have an issue finding this vinyl if you're looking for it. In an interview with Mark Prindle in 2004, Corpsegrinder had this to say in regards to how fans reacted to him replacing Chris Barnes. It was really good. It was positive. People were shocked that Chris was out of the band. I know there were probably some angry people, but every interview I did, my point that I always tried to make was, hey, just give me a chance. Listen to the album. Come to the show. I sing differently than Chris. It's a different style of singing, but it's still death metal. It's still a brutal style of singing. It's different. The closest that he's done to what I do was on the Bleeding, as far as different ranges of vocals, so it's not up to me to decide which is more brutal, but I just wanted people to come to the show and watch it. I mean, the band was still the same. It was still the same people that had played on the Bleeding, and with the exception of Bob Rousset on the previous albums. So just believe in the band, believe in what the decision was, that it was the right decision, and it was in the best interest of the band. I know there's still probably people that like Barnes better, but still like what I do. There are people that like me better, and there are people that just hate me. But for the most part, yeah, it was really positive. The fans really got behind the band and me as well, which was really important because I can believe in myself all I want, and those guys can believe in me. But if the fans aren't buying it as far as the performance, then I'm in trouble. Paul would have this to say about the crowd's reaction to Corpsegrinder on their very first tour promoting Vile. Obviously, there was going to be a bit of skepticism, I suppose, from the fans, which is understandable because we made the change that we did. A lot of people thought we were committing career suicide. How are we going to better the band? We obviously knew what we were doing in that regard, and we knew we were bettering the band by getting George to be the vocalist. But yeah, we had to prove to the world. I think once the album came out, that was a big plus, a sigh of relief, so to speak, once they heard the record. But live, we needed to play live, and those first few shows we did with him, the very first tour, fans had to get used to it. In the beginning, I remember a couple of shows where maybe there was a little bit of slight heckling going on here and there, but that was super short-lived. Once they started playing and they saw the power that George had and his ability as a vocalist, of course, to belt out the lyrics, it was just no looking back. I do recall at the end of the tour, everything was just positive. Every show was positive. There was nothing negative. They were accepting, and everyone saw firsthand what George could bring to the table. All right, so let's talk about Vile. Now, this is obviously the first album with Corpsegrinder. I like to think of it as almost like a second debut album for Cannibal Corpse. It's 11 songs coming in at 37 minutes. I'm obsessed with the censored cover. Clearly, as you can see with my t-shirt, I did buy this at the show that I got to see them at the Diamond Ballroom. So it's literally just like a close-up photo of this man's face. I love the art. I'm obsessed with the art. Now, let's talk about the music. So Vile is, in my opinion, very similar to Eaten Back to Life, the debut of, Cannibal Corpse, obviously the debut of Chris Barnes. I think Vile falls along the same lines as that album. There's a lot of people that don't really like this album, and I think it was originally placed so low and reviewed so low because it's, Corpsegrinder's debut. So instrumentally, I think this album is very, very good. I think it's a very strong opener for Corpsegrinder. I mean, again, we're talking about trying to impress the audience right off the bat with the music. So the music speaks for itself. Is it their absolute best album? No, but I do think that this record is very strong. So Devoured by Vermin, the scream at the beginning of the album, chef's kiss, pinch fingers, such a great way to open up your record and to just instantly grab the attention of the listener. I think the highlights for me on this record are definitely Corpsegrinder's vocals. He's just such a different style of vocalist, but he's also the same, if that makes sense. So where Chris Barnes lacked, Corpsegrinder picks up. So he's very good at enunciating. He has a very, very good scream, and he has a very good high-pitched scream as well. He doesn't utilize it as often as I wish he would. There's a lot of like really nice, memorable guitar riffs and grooves and little pockets, and it's just a very strong album to open up your, new chapter with Corpsegrinder. Gallery, 1998. Following the release of Vile, Cannibal Corpse would begin working on their 6th studio album, I will briefly call Gallery. There were some hardships, however, in the process of the boys recording new songs for this album. At the time, Rob Barrett was having trouble keeping up with what the band wanted and needed to accomplish instrumentally with this 6th studio album. This would ultimately prompt an argument about their musical differences, resulting in Rob Barrett actually leaving the band altogether in February 1997. Rob would then rejoin one of his previous bands, Malevolent Creation, and go on to record guitar for their next 4 albums, starting with their 1998 record, The Fine Art of Murder. To replace Rob, Cannibal Corpse chose none other than Pat O'Brien, who at the time had been on one record with Nevermore, their second album released July 23rd, 1996, The Politics of Ecstasy. And if you really want to feel old, I was born 11 days before the release of this album. You're welcome. Pat had also done a few demos and albums for a number of smaller, lesser-known bands, and based on the timeline, it looks like scoring this guitar gig with Cannibal Corpse was just the big break that Pat was looking for. Replacing Scott Burns as their sound engineer would be Jim Morris, co-founder of Morris Sound Studios. And on April 21st, 1998, just under 2 years since their last record, Gallery would be released on all formats. This 6th studio album would also be their longest album to date, coming in at about 44 minutes of music split between 14 tracks. This is quite the change when you think about it, as all of the previous records were averaging 35 minutes in length. This album also features a 5.5-minute long instrumental track titled From Skin to Liquid. Of course, I love all of the original album art by Vincent Locke, but I have to say, the censored version of this album is very cool. I wasn't expecting a castle in the sky as their album cover, but this reminds me of King Diamond in a way, and I really enjoy it. And for those that are curious, this particular picture is of a CD with the censored cover. There is also a cassette available for purchase with this censored art as well, if you're looking to add to your collection. I wasn't able to find a vinyl version, but I also didn't look too hard. Gallery, let's talk about it. So this is an album that I'm just going to say right off the bat is not as strong as Vile, in my opinion. This album is a lot longer than the previous ones, and with longer albums, you do risk getting a little bit more filler within your tracks. And so this is kind of what I noticed for me personally with Gallery, which is why it kind of is not my favorite album. Not the biggest fan of Gallery, honestly. It's just got a lot of filler. There were probably like 2 or 3 tracks we honestly could have done without, like Crushing the Despised, Headless, and either Every Broken Bone or Centuries of Torment we could honestly have done without. Those did not grab me at all. That being said, the highlights for me were Disposal of the Body, Sentence to Burn, the title track, and From Skin to Liquid. This album, they're definitely exploring more of this darker, moodier, and kind of melodic sound with some of the tracks, but I just feel like some of it fell a little flat for me, and it didn't grab me as much as I really wanted it to. So really, overall, the best thing I can say about this is that it is an okay Cannibal Corpse record. I think coming out of Vile, I was expecting a little bit more, but so that was a little bit of a disappointment. I honestly think it's just too long, and I think there's a lot of tracks that don't really stand out, but the ones that do are really good. I mean, like I said, there's really good like kind of melodic experimentation throughout this, and the guitar tones and riffage like experimented with on this record on the good songs are top notch. Now let's talk about Bloodthirst. This would be Cannibal Corpse's 7th studio album and would be released on October 19th, 1999. 2 things I noticed about this record. The first was the super quick turnaround time between these 2 albums, with just a 1.5 years separating Gallery and Bloodthirst. The second was that Bloodthirst is much shorter in length than Gallery, coming in at 34 minutes, split between 11 songs, almost 10 minutes shorter. This was also the first album where Cannibal Corpse did not record their songs at Moorsound Studios. In fact, they recorded in Tornillo, Texas at a studio called Village Productions. Alex had this to say about Bloodthirst and the choice of using a different studio. "We had a lot of fun with this record. It was great to get away and work at the new studio in Texas, because it seemed that every album that we were recording at Moorsound over the last few years, we were experiencing deja vu with our music. We needed to just find something new with our music, and we found it." Paul had this to say in regards to using a new studio to record Bloodthirst. "It was just a change of scenery. When we first started using Moorsound, we were just being naive, I guess. You know, young kids kind of thing. Oh, we're going to record Moorsound our whole lives, the rest of our career, and it's amazing." And it was. It was incredible, but it was obviously probably being a little unrealistic. You know, we felt after not using Scott Burns, which we thought we would be using Scott Burns for our whole career at that point as well. So then we did the record with Jim Morris. It turned out great. Of course it was awesome. And, you know, we're happy with all of the recordings we've done with all the producers we worked with for that matter. But yeah, it was just time for something new. It was time to move on just to see what else is out there. We had a great time at the ranch down there in Tornillo, Texas, working with Colin Richardson. It was a great experience and something different, something fun. Living on the grounds like that, being away from home, because at that point we had been living in Tampa, Florida to do Vile and Gore Obsessed. It was cool to be somewhere different. In my opinion, Bloodthirst is the most significant album in Cannibal Corpse's discography. You may be asking yourself, well, why is that, Kaiya? Well, I'll explain, and it might come across as a little fruity, but I feel like most of my musician friends will be able to relate to what I'm saying. This record marks almost 10 years since the release of Butchered at Birth. That is 10 years being in the music industry and being signed to a major label. That's 10 years of major worldwide tours and worldwide recognition. Bloodthirst also marks an important piece of the timeline for Corpsegrinder, because this was his third studio album with the band. So essentially what I'm trying to say is the Chris Barnes era has officially been put to rest. Cannibal Corpse was well established and people were familiar with what they could expect with the band, as well as what they could expect with Corpsegrinder as their new singer. So you are a well-established band. Question now is, how do you still impress your fans when things are essentially in this pocket? How are you going to keep things interesting? How are you going to bring something new to the fans? I also want to point out the significance of these band members maturing as people and as musicians. At the time of Bloodthirst's release, the members of Cannibal Corpse were in their late 20s and early 30s. For example, Corpsegrinder was 26 when Vile was created, and he was 29 when Bloodthirst came out. Same with Alex Webster, he was 30 when Bloodthirst was released. These are young men now becoming grown men, maturing in all aspects of their life mentally and physically, and so with that maturity, you will hear an evolution in their sound as well. Vocally, Corpsegrinder will fully develop his voice while learning and adapting to new techniques with this new voice. I know I can definitely hear a difference with his voice when comparing Vile and Bloodthirst. With this maturity, hopefully comes the evolution of self-reflection and understanding how you are as an artist and what skills you can capitalize on and what skills you still need to work on when it comes to music. In conclusion, if you put all of these factors together, their years of professional experience, their maturity as men, and the Barnes era finally being laid to rest, and combine it with Cannibal Corpse breaking out of their shell and using a new studio, it's not really a surprise that many fans consider Bloodthirst to be one of the best Cannibal Corpse records with Corpsegrinder. Some even claim this is the best Cannibal Corpse record over previous Barnes records such as The Bleeding. Many fans at the time were a bit concerned about how this album would sound due to such a short amount of time between releases, but many fans expressed interest in this album because of the vast brutality that it brought in comparison to Gallery. Also, some people thought the art was corny and too cartoonish, and although the original art may not be my favorite album art by the band, the censored version is pretty dope. But I also like almost everything Vincent Locke creates, so I may or may not be totally biased. So, Bloodthirst. Let's talk about everybody's like favorite Cannibal Corpse album. Like, come on, okay? So Bloodthirst. What about this beautiful babe can we describe? So, Bloodthirst to me is like Corpsegrinder's Tomb of the Mutilated. This album is honestly one of the best Corpsegrinder era Cannibal Corpse records. I mentioned in the video that a lot of people thought that this was one of the best Cannibal Corpse records, period. And I think it's definitely a very, very strong contender. This is a very aggressive, very punchy, very unforgiving, brutal slap in the face album. Everything that they could possibly give you with this record, they do it. It is unrelenting as soon as you put it on. From the first song, Pounded into Dust, you can hear the maturity in Corpsegrinder's voice, and that's what I love. That's why I mentioned the maturity of them as artists, is because in Vile, you can hear how young he is, and in this, it's just such a mature, grown sound, and it's very, very pleasant to hear that change. And honestly, Dead Human Collection, banger. Title track, technically, it's called Unleashing the Bloodthirsty. The chorus is slow and groovy, so you do get these little pockets of like groovier sections, but which is a nice, reprieve from the all the aggressiveness, but it's placed very well. It's very, very nice throughout this, and I really like it. I like the final verse too of By the Beast. The lyrics are black forest of evil, a demon's possession, a beast in the wild with nocturnal dementia, scent of fresh human blood invades its dominion, surrounded in darkness she enters a realm of hell. It made me think of Lilith. Lilith from Diablo 4. Girl, off topic, but they did her dirty, okay? They made her so hot, just like the big girl for the, Resident Evil 8. They did those women dirty, okay? And off topic, but that song just makes me think of it. So honestly, a Bloodthirst, she's a winner. She's a very, very solid record. Gore Obsessed would become the 8th album and would be released February 25th, 2002. And like its predecessor, Gore Obsessed would also be recorded in Tornillo, Texas. This time, however, they would record at Sonic Ranch Studios. Hi, Future Kaiya here. I just want to quickly pop in and correct this statement because I found out more information about this studio well after I had recorded the audio for this video, but the correction is Village Productions is actually Sonic Ranch Studios. They just changed their name. So originally I thought that they had switched to a different studio in Tornillo, Texas, because I did think it was interesting that they went back to Tornillo, Texas to a different studio. But no, it's literally the same place. So where they recorded Bloodthirst, Village Productions is also the same place where they did Gore Obsessed, which is Sonic Ranch Studios. They literally just changed their name. It's the same studio in Tornillo, Texas. So yeah, that is the correction. Anyway, let's get back to the video. This album also included a cover of Metallica's No Remorse, which is taken from their debut album Kill 'Em All, released in 1983. When asked about Gore Obsessed, Paul Mazurkiewicz had this to say: "We started to write the material of Gore Obsessed around January last year, 2001. We continued to work on the songs until we entered the studio in June. Everything actually went really smooth. We even did a small tour in the middle of the writing process. Normally we don't do things like that. When we start on something, normally we finish it first, be it tours, writing songs, or whatever. It was a bit different this time, but in the end, everything worked out fine." Neil Kernan was the man who helped produce Gore Obsessed. Pat O'Brien was familiar with Neil's work because he had worked with him previously when he was playing guitar in Nevermore. And although he had a lot of experience recording mostly power metal bands, the rest of the Cannibal Corpse guys were a little on the fence about working with him. Paul said in an interview with Stephen Willems from Voices from the Dark Side, a blog based in Germany, What convinced us in the end to go ahead and work with him was the Macabre album, Dahmer. We really liked the sound of that album. Dahmer really helped us in making a decision. We all were convinced that Gore Obsessed would sound better than Bloodthirst, and it does. What I found interesting about this revelation is that the engineer who helped produce Bloodthirst, Justin Leah, had also been an engineer helping on Macabre's album Dahmer. Whether this connection helped Cannibal in deciding to use Neil Kiernan, I'm not sure. But it's just a reminder that the metal community really is a small world. During this interview, Steven mentioned a story about a woman named Krista Janal, who allegedly vocalized her distaste for Cannibal Corpse so much that she ended up getting the band's first 3 albums completely banned from being sold in Germany. And based on my research, this all began about 6 years earlier in the timeline in 1994, when Krista became aware of Cannibal Corpse's latest albums, which at the time were Butchered at Birth and The Bleeding. What's amazing to me is that Krista almost single-handedly forced Metal Blade to censor those Cannibal albums by replacing the album cover art and halting all printing of lyric sheets. Krista Janal would even go to shows to make sure the band was not performing these songs live, only to discover that they in fact were. This would cause her to go and get the songs banned from being performed. Alex Webster admitted in an interview at the time that he was able to get around this live song ban by not announcing the song titles before performing them. Krista Janal was also the cause for a more toned-down, censored album cover of Vile to be sold in Germany. Based on Wikipedia, Krista is still going against the band as late as 2019. I asked Paul Mazurkowicz about any recent encounters on the situation, and he had this to say.
I remember, when it all came to light. I mean, nothing really ever happened with her crazy. She never did anything per se, other than just her, I think, single-handedly, banning us throughout Germany for the most part. I mean, it was her doing for her to go to the local governments and, to bring it to their attention. I guess, from what we understood, attempt to stop us here, I guess, from selling the albums and playing live and all that kind of stuff. So she never did anything per se that was crazy, like any protests or anything that was, off the wall or any, said nothing crazy like that. She just had it out for us. She really did. She had it out for us. Still does. We still have to deal with this to this date. Ever since it started, I think it was a good 10 years that we couldn't play songs off the first 3 records, and they were banned from being sold and all that kind of stuff. And then basically it got lifted for a little bit there. And then just in the last few years, it wants to rear its head again. And I would imagine, she's obviously has to have a lot to do with that. But just when we went back to Europe this last tour, we had just a couple of cities, not everywhere in Germany. It just depends, too, where you're playing. We had to not play a few songs from certain albums, and then we couldn't sell, CDs or anything with the artwork for the first 3 records again. And, just ridiculous stuff that just doesn't make sense in the whole scheme of things. I do recall, I believe Alex had a conversation with her way back, and it's hard for me to remember this stuff. And I think he met with her at maybe some show or something, and nothing, like I said, nothing happened. It was pretty civil, of course, but she's doesn't matter, even if she met us, and I don't think was going to do any good in a way. She knows what we do, and she doesn't like what we do, I suppose, and it doesn't matter how we are as people or what have you, but but it is pretty ridiculous that it's actually still has to be going on, or that it ever happened to begin with, of course. I mean, it's just music, it's just, fictional stories, and, that somebody would have to, really go out of her way to, to try to prevent things from happening, from, music to be being distributed and, playing songs. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? I mean, I always tell people, I try not to think about it, It's just something so ridiculous that I don't lose sleep over. I just kind of let it just slide off my back and, just, you sit there, of course, and have to ponder for a little bit. Go, man, this is crazy. Why? How is this happening? This is just insane. It's just music and entertainment, and and then you just move on because we were able to move on. I mean, the good thing is we were able to still play in Germany, and we have other songs, we have other albums, of course. I mean, the fans were the ones that lost out when we couldn't play, say, Hammer Smashed Face, or especially that song, of course. So. But she didn't stop us. We're still moving on. We're still here, and she has it out for us. So that's I don't get it, but hope maybe one day it'll finally end. Who knows?
With the growing amount of Cannibal Corpse albums, it was harder for the gentlemen to put together set lists for shows. Paul comments on this as well and says, with each new album, it gets more and more difficult to put a set list together. We are really at the limit at this moment. Each night we play about 18 songs. We try to play at least 2 songs off each album and maybe a little more of the new one. This will get more and more difficult in the future. Stuff I like playing very much, personally, are the fast songs like Pounded into Dust and Devoured by Vermin, or a more slow one like Unleashing the Bloodthirsty. I honestly can't imagine how hard it is to put a set list together when you have as many albums as Cannibal does. I don't even have a third of the albums out that they do, and I always found it hard to pick 10 of my best songs for a live show. I think a lot of people at the time were really wondering what the next album would sound like after Bloodthirst. And I think a lot of fans were going into this next album being like, it's not going to be as good as Bloodthirst, because that was like put on such a high pedestal once it was released and people really got to hear Bloodthirst. Now, Gore Obsessed, I'm telling you, girl, she comes in, and although she's not as strong as Bloodthirst, she is still a bad bitch, okay? She is still here to, come in, break some jaws, take some names, and leave. Like, she is absolutely a great follow-up, in my opinion, to Bloodthirst. I think it's the best that they could honestly do, and I love the vibe change. So for me, Gore Obsessed is still a winner, and we are exploring something a lot different than what we did with Bloodthirst. So Gore Obsessed is darker, moodier, more of this like revengeful, angry, sad kind of vibe to it. It has a lot of emotion backing these songs, whereas like Bloodthirst was this like hateful anger. Gore Obsessed has a little bit more of this like badly wounded and I'm getting my revenge type of vibe. At least that's what I got with it. It's great. Production and mix is nice. George sounds great, of course. His enunciation is just to die for. I love it. And there's just a lot of elements here. There's some tech death elements that they're kind of working with. There's cravey riffage, staccato delivery in some of these songs. Like I said, you're getting this more like darker technical feel. There's like slower emotional elements, groovier elements, like with songs like When Death Replaces Life. There's more of a melodic tone in some of the elements, and I really liked the guitar solo. You also have Mutation of the Cadaver, which features a lot of tech elements, crazy riffage. Sanded Faces also has a nice instrumental outro. You hear some faint screams and what kind of sounds like a vinyl skipping. Like at first I thought I almost stopped the record because I thought it was like my vinyl player, but it's not. It's like a part of it. But it really sets up the ambience. So honestly, Gore Obsessed, I really, really, really enjoyed this record. And like I said, it's a total vibe change. And now the physical copies have No Remorse on it. So it's not really listed on there. But yeah, it's a final track on here. And it's a banger. For Metallica, Barnes, take notes. Like, it's a banger. I want to briefly talk about the EP that was released June 30th, 2003, titled Worm Infested. I absolutely love this album's cover art. The woman looks like a sexy goth babe. Included on this EP are 6 songs, which are all unreleased tracks from their previous albums, Gore Obsessed, Gallery, Vile, and Bloodthirst. The track list includes a Possessed cover, Confessions, which is from their 1987 EP, The Eyes of Horror, as well as the No Remorse cover from Metallica that was featured as a bonus track of Gore Obsessed. It seems that the Metallica cover is only available on physical copies of the albums. Looking at the digital versions, No Remorse is not officially listed within the track list. There are some physical copies you can pick up of Worm Infested if you're still missing this in your collection. Hell's Headbangers printed 10 of Cannibal Corpse's albums on cassette, as well as this EP. And I just checked their website recently, and you can still purchase this exact cassette for $12 US. This may change at any time. Fun fact about this album, thanks to Krista Janal, was up until 2005, which, for context, that would be the first 2 years of this EP's lifetime, Worm Infested was banned in Germany from being sold to minors under the age of 18 and from being played live. As of 2006, Cannibal Corpse can play songs off this EP live now. However, due to the cover art, no physical copies of Worm Infested can be sold in Germany. The Wretched Spawn, 2004. 8 months after the release of Worm Infested EP, Cannibal Corpse would release their 9th studio album, The Wretched Spawn. Just like the previous full-length Gore Obsessed, this album would be recorded at Sonic Ranch in Texas, with Neil Kiernan helping to mix and produce the album. The Wretched Spawn would be officially released on February 24th, 2004, just one day after Deicide would release their 7th studio album, Scars of the Crucifix. The Wretched Spawn would be a little bit longer than the previous release, with 13 tracks coming in at about 44 minutes. Prior to the official release, Metal Blade had pushed out a press copy to many different reviewers, internet personnel, and magazines. These pre-release CDs actually had beeps added to the music to censor certain lyrics in the song. After realizing how awful it sounded and how much it ruined the experience, Alex vowed never to release censored versions like that again for pre-release. When asked about the concept of the songwriting for The Wretched Spawn, Jack Owen had this to say: "I can speak for myself and my songs and say that I dug deep for the best music I could write and took upon myself to write the lyrics as well. For songs like Nothing Left to Mutilate and Decency Defied, I looked to friends for ideas they had. Decency was based on a friend who had a nightmare that her tattoos were being torn off while she was still alive. Nothing Left was based on an idea from a friend who was studying pheromones in college and told me all about how a woman's scent drives men crazy. So if my imagination doesn't kick in, I draw from other things. Slain was based on the Clint Eastwood film High Plains Drifter, and Festering in the Crypt is my own idea of dealing with the finality of death." Alex Webster was asked about The Wretched Spawn and whether he thought the recording of this 9th album was easier or more difficult. He said, "It was, for me, not too bad. I came in very prepared this time, just for my bass. I was pretty well prepared and I got through everything really quickly. I practiced a lot before I got in there, so it was no problem. For some of the other things, it was tough. I read a lot of the lyrics, and sometimes working in the studio with George can be difficult. I'm trying to tell him what I'd like for him to sing, but it's not always easy for me to explain what I want out of the lyrics I wrote. Sometimes this can be frustrating for both of us. I think there's some other things too. Some things go faster than other things in the studio, but overall it was not hard. I would say to this date, the hardest album for us to record was our 4th album, but believe me, that was a tough one to record. I will never forget having to record that one, and I never want to do a record that's that hard again. It was really hard to record." I think it's important to note the change in the metal scene surrounding Cannibal Corpse during this time. I think it's important to look at because the Cannibal musicians were now in legendary status. They didn't need to prove anything. Their worth and status in the industry was already solidified. With the death metal scene growing at such a fast rate, it's no wonder the Cannibal Corpse boys would begin to see their influence in the genre and in other bands throughout the years leading up to this recent album. I think that this is something that modern day musicians and bands will never really be able to experience. Because for metal and really any genre as of 2024, everything has already been created. All of the OGs of any genre have already released the sounds we love today. When we look at pop icons, you've got Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Britney Spears. We will probably never have performers as legendary as them again. And for death metal, it's the same thing. Cannibal Corpse, Death, Deicide, Obituary, just to name a few. At this point in time, I believe the younger bands around Cannibal were noticeably using their influence to market themselves and create a brand that was similar but different in their own ways. I can only imagine how interesting of a position that must be, to see your influence in other bands and to hear it as well, while you yourself are also touring and recording for your legendary band. After the release of The Wretched Spawn, Jack Owen would quit the band, stating that he wanted to try something new after years of being in a rut with Cannibal Corpse. His exact words were, "It wasn't the music. With Cannibal Corpse, it felt like working at an old job that I had to step away from." Jack Owen would then join Tampa-based death metal band Deicide in late 2004 and would actually stay with them until 2016, with their 2006 album The Stench of Redemption being the first album with Jack Owen on guitar. I also want to briefly mention further down Jack's timeline that he would end up joining 6 Feet Under with Chris Barnes after leaving Deicide and would be featured on their 2020 album Nightmares of the Decomposed and their most recent 2024 release, Killing for Revenge. And honestly, the latter album is not a bad album. I thought Jack Owen sounded very good on that record. However, imagining Jack Owen on Nightmares of the Decomposed, I'm not going to lie, it hurts me a little. Just a little. But at least Jack stayed within the realm of his friends and death metal family. Obviously, his history with both Barnes and Glenn Benton of Deicide doesn't really need an explanation. I just think it's cool that even though he was eventually unfulfilled in Cannibal Corpse, he stayed nearby and didn't forget where he came from. So The Wretched Spawn, let's talk about her. If I had to pick an album that was like my least favorite for Cannibal Corpse, it would be The Wretched Spawn, which is very disappointing for me. It was very disappointing to listen to this album and walk away from this album with that knowledge in mind, because I love everything else about this album. Like, I love the name of it and the artwork. Vincent Locke, you're delivering. Like, I love everything about this album except the music. So, where did it go wrong? The first thing is the lyrics. To me, they're very cringe and corny. They're not for me. And I feel like this is the weakest Corpsegrinder album for his vocals. They just don't sound very good. To me, they don't sound as like strong and powerful. They just sound a little bit tired and used, in my honest opinion. And instrumentally, there's just nothing new that they're bringing to the table. It sounds tired, it sounds repetitive, and it sounds like everything else that they have recorded in the past, and not in a good way. It doesn't stand out to me, and it just sounds like an album full of filler, unfortunately. Like, honestly, I think that Gallery is way better than, The Wretched Spawn, and that even had some filler tracks on it. So I think that this one honestly is just full of filler, and it's not very good. Rotted Body, Landslide, kind of cringe lyrically. Slain is next after that, and I was like, this album is kind of boring. Like, it was just boring, and I say that with a lot of love in my heart, because bestie, like, coming out of Bloodthirst and Gore Obsessed, I was expecting a lot with this record. Not a lot, but I was expecting something, and what we got just didn't hit me in the right places, but that's okay. Kill, 2006. Kill would be the 10th studio album released in Cannibal Corpse's discography and would be available to purchase on March 20th, 2006. To replace Jack Owen, Rob Barrett would come back sometime in late 2005 and ask to rejoin. It was important, however, to Alex at this time to make sure that everything Rob was dissatisfied with before he left was no longer going to be an issue. When Rob convinced the Cannibal Corpse musicians that he had no issues with the band and that rejoining was for sure something he wanted, he was officially let back in as a permanent member. Headlines and news sources would promote this state of affairs along with the release of the album's title on December 7th, 2005. 4 months before its official release. Alex was quoted saying, "Hey everybody, since word seems to be out, we figured we'd make it official. Our new album will be entitled Kill. Also, although everybody probably already had figured this out, we'll make it official as well. Guitarist Rob Barrett has rejoined as a permanent member. He has contributed a song to the new album as well." I think it's really cool that once he rejoined, he was still able to contribute, rather than just play what was already written and having to wait until the next album. Instead of the band recording in Texas, they decided to remain in Florida and chose Mana Recording Studios in St. Petersburg, Florida, owned by producer-engineer Eric Rutan. Eric would not only allow Cannibal to record Kill at his studio, but he would also help in producing their 10th studio album. Eric Rutan also had a great track record in the death metal scene in Florida. By this time in 2006, Eric had played guitar for 2 albums with Morbid Angel. The first was Domination, released in 1995. The second was Gateways to Annihilation, released in the year 2000. Eric was also the vocalist for the Tampa-based death metal band Hate Eternal, which had released 3 albums at the time of Kill's release. Little did Eric know that he would also become a primary member of Cannibal Corpse in just over a decade. At the time of Kill's release, it would blow up on the charts, peaking at number 170 on the Billboard 200 chart. This would also be known as the most safe album cover in the entire band's catalog. Personally, this is my least favorite album cover of Cannibal Corpse for obvious reasons. I think there could have been something completely different instead of just the words kill, but that is just my opinion. When asked about the album cover art, Alex said, "The original art that Vince gave us was really cool, but we didn't think it would make the best cover. We decided to use it as interior art and just have a simple band logo, album title type cover. The main focus of our band should be the music anyway, so I don't think it's a big deal that the cover's not a blood-soaked scene of carnage the way our others have been. This doesn't mean we won't have more bloody covers in the future, though." Kill! Let's talk about Kill. Now, aside from the fact that I am completely 100% in love and obsessed with the vinyl color, okay? So maybe I'm a little biased. Maybe I'm a little biased because I'm obsessed with the vinyl color, okay? You give me a pink vinyl, bestie, and I'm gonna buy it. But regardless, I am not a fan of the album cover. I think it's boring. It doesn't hit me in the places I want to be hit. But the music, ultimately, just like Alex Webster said, is the most important part of the whole thing anyway. So this album, I think, is pretty solid. I think it's pretty solid. I don't think it's as good as Bloodthirst or Gore Obsessed. I think it's definitely better than The Wretched Spawn. So they definitely redeemed themselves from The Wretched Spawn. It's better, too, than Gallery, I believe. So, yeah, it's brutal, catchy, corpse sounder sounds amazing. And, I thought it was good. The Time to Kill Is Now was a very good opener in my opinion, and then you also had Make Them Suffer right after that. That was a banger, so automatically the album starts out like punching you in the face. And yeah, I just remember it being infinitely better than The Wretched Spawn almost immediately. Evisceration Plague, 2009. After Kill, Cannibal Corpse released Evisceration Plague on February 2nd, 2009, and this album would actually peak at number 66 on the Billboard chart. This album would also be recorded in St. Petersburg, Florida at Mana Studios the year prior. Evisceration Plague would also be another album featuring a more censored album cover with no gore or suggestive artwork. It's a haunting picture, yes, but in my honest opinion, the faces of the characters in this painting are a bit goofy, and it's a very dark album cover. It's really not my favorite. This album would also prove to be a huge collector's piece years after its release, as it was only printed on vinyl one time in 2009 in various limited edition colors. There were picture discs printed for reissue in 2014, but no regular vinyls. There is currently a copy of an original first pressing vinyl from 2009 that is $249 US. This is the last album we are currently waiting on, so I am hoping that they do a reissue soon. Okay, so now we're going to be getting more into like quick reviews because we are, talking about more modern albums. So there's not been, thankfully, a lot of like drama or really much of anything to report between like Evisceration Plague and the albums that we have right now. So Evisceration Plague, short and sweet kind of review. It has a lot of groove, a lot of short stop transitions between the songs, and this album was a good album. It was a good album. Like, honestly, I think it's about like a 7.5 out of 10. Is it the best album they have in their discography? No, I would definitely place it below Bloodthirst and Gore Obsessed. I would probably put it a little bit below Kill, but it is still very solid. It's definitely better than the Wretched Spawn. It's solid. It's solid Cannibal Corpse. And we know by now that like Cannibal Corpse, their discography doesn't change that much. Like where they do add diversity is within the instrumentals. So they add that diversity within like either using, my light just went out, you're welcome. They use that diversity by adding, a different style of guitar tone or a different riffage or whatever, So this album, I think, is good, and I think it's a fine album. It's a fine album. Honestly, so rude of you to, like, turn off. Torture, 2012. Torture would be the 12th studio album released by Cannibal Corpse on March 12th, 2012, and like Evisceration Plague, this album would feature a more toned-down cover, albeit I really enjoy the creepiness of Torture. Also, like its predecessor, Torture would be released on vinyl only once the year it was released, making this yet another very valuable piece of vinyl for collectors of Cannibal Corpse memorabilia. Also, I want to briefly mention how 6 Feet Under also released, in my opinion, their best record, which is Undead, this same year, just a couple months later on May 24th, 2012. I am mentioning this because I was interested in picking up a vinyl copy of this record for my collection, only to find out that just like Torture, Undead was only printed once for vinyl, with original copies being sold at over $100. If you work for Metal Blade, or know someone who does, please, for the love of God, tell them that they need to repress these older vinyls and stop sleeping on it. Thank you. Also, whoever says Cannibal Corpse isn't mainstream needs to be fact-checked, because this album peaked at number 38 on the Billboard 200, and Cannibal's next album, which we're going to be talking about, Skeletal Domain, would peak even higher. So my girl, Torture. We love her. So this is an album that did chart number 38 on the top 200 Billboard chart, and I can see why. This is a very strong, kind of mainstream album, a little bit, and I don't say that in a bad way. When Cannibal Corpse goes more mainstream in their sound, what they're really experimenting with is so much catchy, memorable, diverse tracks. So when they go this more mainstream route, you've got guitar solos that you can actually remember after you like turn the record off. You can think of individual like 4 or 5 tracks like, oh yeah, that riff was awesome, and you can kind of remember it and sing it. A lot of the bridges or choruses have very catchy sections of their songs with lyrics that you can remember, with melodies that you can remember, and that is what you get with Torture. So Torture is absolutely full of these catchy, memorable sections with great guitar riffs and grooves. It is just full of grooves, like as deep as the knife will go. Catchy chorus, you can sing along to it, and I can see why this album charted as high as it did. Intestinal Crank is also very catchy. It's repetitive in a few ways, but like not in a bad way. Nice breakdowns, great album. And yeah, like I said, catchy all the way around. So I like Torture. I think it is just a little bit better than Evisceration Plague. So this is a very strong album. Very strong album. A Skeletal Domain, 2014. This album would feature the same lineup with Pat O'Brien and Rob Barrett on guitar. Cannibal did record this album at Audible Hammer Studios in Sanford, Florida, and this album would also be Cannibal's highest charting album, reaching number 32 on the Billboard 200. And just like Torture and Evisceration Plague, A Skeletal Domain would only be printed on vinyl one time in 2014, the year it was released. Even though this record is only 10 years old, which at the time I'm filming this video, it's currently 2024, this is still considered a long time for not repressing a re-release. 10 more years and it's considered a vintage vinyl. We are already 15 years into Evisceration Plague's lifespan. In 2029, that record will be considered vintage. Are we going to get a repress anytime soon? As of 2024, this would be the last safe album cover featuring no blood, gore, or suggestive imagery. A Skeletal Domain is also dedicated to a man named Michael Trengert, who also goes by Mike, who was a Metal Blade manager at the time before he passed away on September 23rd, 2013, at the young age of 45. I wish I had a Skeletal Domain shirt that I could wear to like rep this album. So, Skeletal Domain. I am so excited about this album. So, this album charted really high when it was originally released at number 32 on the top 200 Billboard charts. Now, a lot of people don't care about that. Taylor Swift does, but for Cannibal Corpse, for a death metal band as like extreme and as gory as Cannibal Corpse is, that's a pretty big deal and that's pretty admirable. And I really like that this album went as far as it did because I love this album. The absolute creepiness, it's kind of like a concept album. It listens like a concept album and it makes me feel, it makes me think of like some sort of battle, exactly like what Vincent Locke captured on the album cover is how this album sounds. It's so perfect. You literally have the first track, High Velocity Impact, introduce you with this super creepy, eerie intro, and it's such a good start. And it just paints this battle. The exact album cover, all the songs paint this battle of like storming this castle, or you know, these like I guess zombies coming up. The title track absolutely, of course, paints this battle. It paints this battle. And it's great. I really like it, and I like the way that it ends with Skeletal Domain. It's like the last lyric you hear because it feels like it's paying homage to the album. I mean, it obviously is, but it just the way it lingers in the song is so cool, and it's such a great way to write your song and have it be the title track, have it be a standout track within the album. So I could see how this album charted as high as it did because it is like Torture, but like on steroids. It is literally so, just everything about it is perfect. And I really, really enjoy it. It is such a strong album. Like, I would put it up there, honestly, with Bloodthirst at this point, and I might even put it a little bit above Gore Obsessed because it's matching all the things that I want. It's kind of their like creepiest, darkest sounding album in my opinion. That being said, The Murderous Pact is my least favorite song on this album, although I did enjoy the guitar solo from Pat O'Brien. That was a very redeeming factor for it. B-side, Flipping Over, starts with Funeral Cremation, which also opens up into this like amazing section. It's just it's so good. It's so good. Yeah, I mean, what more can I say? Like, go listen to Skeletal Domain, honestly. Red Before Black, 2017. Red Before Black would be released November 3rd, 2017, and would feature the same lineup as before. However, the band would end up returning to Mana Studios in St. Petersburg, Florida to record this album. Because Red Before Black is relatively new, it's not too challenging to find a copy of this album on vinyl. However, this album has only been pressed once with a few limited edition color versions and a picture disc in early 2018. On December 10th, 2018, Pat O'Brien would be arrested for burglary and assault of a police officer. The next week, police would discover more than 80 firearms and 3 human skulls in his home. Pat's arrest came just one day after the band officially announced that Cannibal Corpse would be supporting Slayer on their final tour in North America. And this event would also cause a bit of a funny meme on the internet, where it shows the article of Pat O'Brien and these firearms and everything being found in his home, with 2 songs saying, "I have guns in my house for murder," and "My home is full of skulls," with the title "Makes Sense." Now, even though I like this meme and find it funny, both of these tracks are actually fake songs. Although Cannibal Corpse does have songs that are relatively similar in nature to the songs that are titled in here, they are not actually real tracks. This album is not as strong to me as Skeletal Domain, but it's still a good, catchy, mainstream sounding Cannibal Corpse record in all of the best ways, not to mention the fact that we also have blood and gore and whatever back on the album covers, which is very nice. Now, somebody said that they wish that Cannibal Corpse kind of explored more color palettes with their album covers. Whether or not you agree or disagree, I do enjoy the kind of like contrast between like the green background and the red actual blood on the cover. I think it's great. So it was nice to see blood, I guess. That sounds bad, but it was fun to be able to see some gore back again, you know? And so this is a long album. It's 46 minutes long. But like I said, this is a pretty decent album. It's not their best, but it's definitely not the worst, for sure. And so I think it is what it is. It's just, you know, an average, normal Cannibal Corpse album, but it's a little bit better than average. So Shredding My Human Skin has some melodic elements that I really enjoyed in the chorus. And the title track is brutal. There's not much difference once the third track comes in with Code of the Slashers, but I still think it's a banger, especially with the final like line of it saying, "We'll end your effing life." Wow, the way Corpsegrinder says that is so satisfying. Honestly, this album feels familiar, it feels nostalgic, and it feels campy in like a good way. And I think that's kind of how you could describe a lot of Cannibal Corpse's albums, and I didn't realize this until recently, that is the best way to describe it. Is it's nostalgic, it's campy, but it's in, like I said, a good way. It's like watching your favorite horror movie, just to, you know, for the feels, you know? A lot of people think like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, which I just watched, is kind of a campy horror movie. This is a campy album. You know what you're gonna get. They deliver in the pockets that you know they're gonna deliver, and it's a good, normal, nostalgic Cannibal Corpse album. And so it is it's definitely better than The Wretched Spawn. So there you go. Violence Unimagined 2021. Violence Unimagined would be the 15th studio album and would be released April 16th, 2021, and feature 11 tracks, coming in at just over 42 minutes in length. This was my first full-length album and introduction into Cannibal Corpse after the reaction I did on them when I first started my channel. The booklet I am showing you in the pictures right now was given to me by a wonderful Patreon supporter of mine, Haunted Entity. The booklet comes with the CD as well as the Oxblood vinyl. Violence Unimagined, pinched fingies. There is going to be bias here because I am married to the song Ritual Annihilation. The breakdown of that song gives me life. It gives me life. The way I feel about Ritual Annihilation is how I feel about Solastalgia, being the one and only song that I like off of Terrorsight by Cattle Decapitation, but in a different way. So it's like, for Cattle, I really only like Solastalgia off that album, and then everything else kind of falls flat for me. With Violence Unimagined, it's kind of, but not really, in the same boat for me as Gallery. Gallery, like I said, had a few kind of dud tracks for me. Violence Unimagined has a lot more bangers, and then it has its beautiful diamond gem, Ritual Annihilation. So I am going to rate this album at a much higher rating than Gallery, because that song is so effing banger. It is so good. Necrogenic Resurrection is brutal, punchy, unrelenting. Murderous Rampage also immediate blast beats, and I love the open notes that are within the verses. It's just a dank album. Now, that being said, on the B side, there are a few duds for me personally. It's really like the last 3 tracks are just not totally my jam, and that could honestly just be because Ritual Annihilation is already played. And I literally listen to that song on repeat when I'm in the mood, and I'm like, yes. Like, oh God, it's so good. It's so good. Like, if I could marry a metal song, it would be that song. So, Violence Unimagined, you're a winner. You're a little bit above Gallery. You do have a couple fillers, but it's not a bad album. And honestly, I would even say, and a lot of other people have said, that Violence Unimagined is a good kind of starter album to introduce Cannibal Corpse, like new fans to Cannibal Corpse. But honestly, yeah, I mean, I would put Violence Unimagined there, but I would start some newcomers off with like Skeletal Domain, Bloodthirst, Gore Obsessed, or Torture. Chaos Horrific 2023. Now let's talk about Cannibal Corpse's most recent release as of this video, Chaos Horrific, which came out September 22nd, 2023, and was released on the 31st anniversary of Tomb of the Mutilated. Chaos Horrific is also dedicated to Trevor Strnad of Black Dahlia Murder, who passed away on May 11th, 2022. So I have reviewed this album in the past. I have listened to it. Y'all saw the vinyl in the video or are about to see it. So, Chaos Horrific, like at the time when I listened to it, I had not listened to all of the Cannibal Corpse albums. I had listened to Violence Unimagined at the time, and I knew after listening to Chaos Horrific that Violence Unimagined was significantly better and just clicked with me more than Chaos Horrific. And so I said in that review that it is a classic Cannibal Corpse album, but there's nothing very special about it. Now, with Red Before Black, I mentioned, it's kind of this nostalgic, campy record, right? That is above average for an average Cannibal Corpse album. Chaos Horrific, after everything I've listened to, is probably one of the most disappointing new albums to come out of 2023 now that I'm listening to it. So if I had reviewed that album knowing everything I know now when this album came out, I would be disappointed, because this album, Chaos Horrific, is not very good in my opinion, and I think it's honestly one of my least favorite records in their entire discography. It's not as bad as The Wretched Spawn, but it's down there with The Wretched Spawn, and it's down there with Gallery. Like, I was surprised too. If that's kind of shocking for you, it was a little bit shocking for me, walking away from that listening experience being like, man, I could think about like basically like their entire discography that is much better than Chaos Horrific. So that's okay. Sometimes, you're not a real growing, learning artist if you don't have a couple duds, okay, in your discography. It's okay to have some duds. If I had listened to this in 2023 when it first came out, knowing what I know now, I would have been a little bit more harsh on it, and I would have thought it's not as solid of a project as I originally thought it was. Violence Unimagined was just like you know. Anyway, y'all, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into Cannibal Corpse. It was very, very fun and a little taxing to do. I'm not gonna lie, but it was fun nonetheless. It was fun to be able to really dive into this band's discography and really look at each album individually, and assess how I feel about it, and look at the history and the growth of these gentlemen and the growth of this band. And now it's something I fully understand. It's something that I fully get and can picture, and I think that that's really great. So Cannibal Corpse will always be one of my favorite bands. They are what started my YouTube channel being what it is, and yeah, they will always hold a very special place in my heart. So I really hope you enjoyed this deep dive. If you want to see more deep dives like this, or more deep dives like, you know, the 6 Feet Under video or whatever, let me know down below in the comments. You can also suggest bands you would like me to do videos like that for, and don't forget to like, subscribe, share this video with your friends if you enjoyed it, and yeah, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you being here, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, you guys.